The world history scheme, such as exists, of course, is that essentially you have ancient Greece created everything. The Romans copied Greece. Ugly religious fanaticism came along and ruined classical civilization. And you had the Dark Ages from 500 to 1000 when nothing happened at all, except that Charlemagne placed a Latin book under his pillow and tried to study Latin but couldn't become literate. So that was sort of the symbol of the whole period of the Dark Ages. And then after 1000, things finally start to get going as you have some European protagonists at last emerging. And if you looked at the ancient historical period, you will observe that the typical division of history into ancient, medieval, modern follows a pattern used very often. And for example, at the University of Washington, where the professor who taught ancient history would come in and he'd have a class of 550 students, 6 TAs, 3 readers. I was a TA in that class. And he would spend one day on the ancient Near East and then on to Greece. And so you get this as the view of world history. Now, I really should have some map up here, but I don't know, I should take time out to draw one. But if you can imagine the Mediterranean world and so on, how you have it in your history books, that usually the only time India comes into history before the British is when Alexander the Great marches in and marches out. And likewise, the Persian Empire and the East loses all interest after Alexander, no one hears about Persia and Iraq after that. And when the Romans come in, the curtain is lowered on everything east of the Euphrates River, so that you see in your maps that you put up on the wall to show the students, or the maps in the textbook showing the Roman Empire in all its glory sprawled out around the Mediterranean, there's some little label on the eastern border that says Parthia, or later on the Sassanid Empire. And people think, oh, that's nice, there must be another tribe of German barbarians over there. This is some little barbaric place on the border which has no color indicating that it was a state, unlike the Roman Empire. And so you have the Roman Empire was the universal world empire, and there was nothing else. Iraq ceases to exist when the Talmud was written down in Iraq, and where Iraq and Egypt remained the most heavily populated countries west of India, and yet you never hear anything about them. Nothing creative came out of those places, as if all the people lived and died there and never did a thing. And then, when you get to the fall of Rome in the West, in 476, suddenly the curtain moves westward again. And now you have the Dark Ages because you're only concentrating on Western Europe. And since Western Europe was the most rustic and backward part of the Roman Empire, when you cut out all of the light by putting the curtain closer to you, naturally you have darkness. And so that's all that has happened, because civilization kept on flourishing, albeit with its ups and downs. This atlas I've found always to be useful, even though the text still is not correct. But the maps, they go a little bit farther. So you can see in the case of, probably can't see this, but in the case of the Roman Empire here, which is still marked out with a very definite big black line to show that that's where the action is, you still have the Persian Empire at least acknowledged as a state over here. Of course, by the time of the prophet, the Roman Empire in the West had vanished, and there was more of a parity between the surviving Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Empire here. And that was the world situation into which the prophet was born. The Arabs, Arabia, independent, separate, as it had been before. The boundary, somewhat to the east of the Euphrates River bend here, running between the Roman and Persian empires, had been there since when? How long had the Roman and Persian empires stood facing each other? And I'm counting Parthia as the part of the Persian history. Can you repeat the question? When did the Romans and the Persians first clash in battle? And who was killed in that battle? 53 BC at the Battle of Carrhae, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the one who defeated Spartacus in the movie Spartacus, you remember? Destroyed the slave revolt in 71 BC. Well, Kirk Douglas was Spartacus. I don't remember. I don't remember who the actor was who played Crassus. But anyway, Crassus was the Roman general who eventually defeated Spartacus. Anyway, it went way back, way back early. From 53 BC to the time of the prophet in the 600, this border lasted, an artificial border cutting the Aramaic-speaking region in half, lasted for 700 years, where these two alien empires, ruled by people who spoke languages other than those used in the Middle East, colonized and lorded it over those people. The Persian Empire was ruled by Iranian-speaking Persians, but the Iraqi people were Aramaic-speaking Semites. Likewise, the Roman Empire ruled over Aramaic-speaking Syria and Coptic-speaking Egypt. These were not provinces that spoke Greek, even though their documents, their government business was carried on in Greek, but the language of the people was not that. And that had led by this time to a severe split in both empires, where the rule in the Middle Eastern provinces of the imperial governments was deeply resented. That, to some extent, sets the stage for the expansion that happened after that. And for the Prophet Muhammad, these were distant realities, because there wasn't any such rule going on right in Arabia. There was stuff going on. When the Prophet was about 6 years old, the Persians sent an expedition and conquered Yemen, something which people would hardly know about. They conquered it from the Ethiopians. This map, in its inimitable Western way, it cuts off right where the Ethiopian Empire was, the Empire Kingdom of Aksum, and so it omits it from this. In fairness to the writer, his earlier, this is the medieval atlas, the ancient history atlas shows Abyssinia, and so he gets some points for that, but he doesn't get them here, where that is cut off. And that shows typical negligence of things African, just like when Christians argue about the canon of the Bible, and they say, well, the Catholic canon is this, and the Greek Orthodox is this, and the Russian Orthodox is this, and the Protestant is this. They never consider the Ethiopian canon. They don't consider what the Ethiopian church deemed scripture. And similarly, the Yemeni Ethiopian civilization that existed there, hardly any attention is ever paid to that. By this time, Yemen spoke Arabic, so its own native South Arabian language had been supplanted by Arabic. And in fact, half of the people in Syria spoke Arabic too. That was because perhaps the Arabian Peninsula was one of those reservoirs of people where emigration was constantly going on, and the Arabic language, therefore, came to be spread outside the bounds of what is now Saudi Arabia, even in these early times.